Hi, I'm Greg Campbell with Fortus Pilates. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the main carriage wheels on one of our Aluminum Elite Studio reformers. So there's three basic steps that we're going to need to go through in order to replace the carriage wheels. The first step is we're actually going to have to remove this whole rear section of the reformer because the carriage can't be lifted out. It's actually embedded inside the track of the frame. So what we'll do is we'll remove this rear section of the frame. Then we can slide the carriage out, replace the wheels, slide the carriage back in, and reconnect the rear portion of the frame. So those are the basic steps. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to want to do is just get rid of the rear posts and the straps and the ropes. We don't need that. It's just going to be in the way. So that is a very simple process, right? I'll just remove the rope. There's the first one and pull that through the pulley. Okay, so we'll get rid of that and we'll put it aside. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. Through. Okay, that's that one gone. And then for the posts, you just pull the pin out. So that's very straightforward. So one's out and the other one's out. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to getting this rear section off of the frame. So what we'll do, number one, is this wood piece that's on the top. We can actually get that removed. And let me show you how it is that we do that. In order to complete this part of the process, removing this wood capping that's here, you're going to need three tools. You're going to need two different sizes of Allen keys, and these would have come in your tool sets that you received with your reformers, but if you can't find your toolkit, you threw it away or whatever, they're just normal Allen keys. If you get normal metric Allen keys, you'll have the right sizes. And likewise, you're going to need an adjustable wrench, okay? Because how these are held on, these pieces of grip tape that are here, in addition to being sort of functional, they're also hiding a little secret. And if you peel up the grip tape, what you'll see is that there's a little bolt that's sitting in here. And likewise, there's one on either side of this longer piece of grip tape and one over here as well. So there's 4 bolts total that we're going to have to remove. So for these outside ones, we just grab our smaller Allen key and we'll use that Allen key. And let me just, there's then also down below, so sort of right underneath here on the inside of the frame, you can't see it, but I can feel it with my finger. I see I'm turning it here. There's a nut that's connecting to the other side of this bolt. That's what's tightening up against it. So I'm just going to take my adjustable wrench and I'm going to get it on that nut to hold that nut securely in place. And then I just take the bolt out. Okay. I think that's almost got it there now. Once you get it loose enough, you can just use your fingers to hang on to the nut while you twist it out. And there we go. Okay, so there's one there. And what I'll do is, you'll see in here, this nut, there's actually a washer that's in here as well. Okay, what I'll do just to make sure I don't lose any parts, I'm just going to actually leave the bolt and the washer in there. I'm just going to put the nut aside. So now I'm going to go and basically I'm going to repeat that process for the other 3 bolts. The 2 bolts that are on this longer piece of grip tape, they're a little bit bigger, same process, but I'm just going to use the larger size Allen key. So I'll kind of do this, in fast forward here. It's the same process I just went through. I'm just loosening them up and removing that nut, and then that'll allow this wood piece to get removed. Okay, so I've got all 4 of these bolts loosened up now. So this wood piece will now just lift completely off. So I'll just put that to the side along with the nuts that came with it. And we can move on to the next step. Okay, now what I'm going to do, there's actually a step that I skipped that we should have done at the start, and I'll do it now before I take the rest of the rear frame off. And that is we have to get rid of these carriage stoppers. So the carriage stoppers are what prevent the carriage from being able to go too far to the rear. And then obviously, since our goal of this whole exercise is to actually remove the carriage completely so we can replace the wheels, we will have to get rid of these carriage stoppers and put them aside. So we'll use our same small Allen key that we were just using. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Allen key and I'm going to put it into the carriage stopper bolt. There's a bolt that's sitting here inside the carriage stopper, so my Allen key fits in that. And I'll take my trusty adjustable wrench, and there's actually 2 nuts that secure this. And so I'll use my wrench to loosen the first one, which is the cap nut. So you can see it's got a rounded top on it. And then there's still another nut that's locking it on here. And I do the same thing. I'm going to take my wrench, I'm going to loosen that up. And once it's loosened, I can do it by hand. And there we go. Okay, there's the other nut there. So now this bolt that's holding it on can come off, and the carriage stopper itself can come off. Now, what you might find, sometimes this carriage stopper, even after you've removed both bolts and you pull the bolt out, sorry, you remove both nuts and you pull the bolt out, what you're sometimes going to find, take that out of there, there we go, is that this is still stuck on the frame just because of how it's been pinched in by the bolt. So if you just really pry at it from the sides, you'll find that it will pop off, okay? And you'll be able to put that aside. So that's the whole assembly for the carriage stopper. And what I'll do is, what I always do when I'm taking things apart is I put them back in the order that I took them apart, just so it's obvious to me when I go to reassemble the way it was supposed to be, right? And so I'll put it back together. I'll turn it on a little bit more. Exactly the way I found it, and then I just have to reassemble it in that same way. So we'll be putting that back on at the end of the process, okay? So now I go ahead, I repeat that process for the other carriage stopper on the other side. Okay, so now it's time to remove the 3 bolts that are actually connecting the side rails to the rear frame. Okay, so that's these 3 bolts that are right here. There's 1, 2, 3. So these are the 3 bolts, and I actually don't need to remove them. If you look, you can see that there's a cutout that's much larger at the top that the bolt kind of is slotting into. So the idea is I just have to loosen these bolts. If I loosen them, I'll be able to lift the frame up, which will bring the bolts up, and then they'll slide through this larger hole that's here in the frame. So that's the idea. I don't need to take these out all the way. I just need to loosen them. Which is good because they're a little bit of a pain because they're in a very confined space to work in. So you will have received in your tools, you'll have received a wrench like this that you can use to complete this part of the job. I find it to be very difficult to use this wrench to do it, honestly. This wrench is very short, it's very thin, and these bolts are on pretty tight for obvious reasons. We want the frame nice and secure. So I find that this isn't really the best tool for this job. It's quite difficult. You can do it in a pinch, but your better option is going to be, if you've got a wrench set, this is a 12mm long wrench. This is the perfect tool for this job, especially if you get one that has this loop at the back. And this is just a Canadian Tire wrench, so you can just pick these things up anywhere or go on Amazon and get a long 12mm wrench with the loop at the end. That's going to be much easier. So that's what I'll use. And so essentially all I want to do is tighten up, or loosen up, I should say, these bolts, which I just do by putting them on. And give it a couple of, quarter turns, just enough so that bolt is nice and loose. So that one is. I'll go down and do the other 2. Just make sure they're nice and loose. Okay, I think that one should be good. And then likewise for the last one. And you can see how much an advantage it is to have this long wrench with this bolt, with these 2 bolts that are down there at the bottom. Makes it a lot easier. Okay. Okay, so that should be pretty good now. Okay, so this is sort of, it's just gravity now that's holding this on. I'm going to be able to lift it off now and then take the entire rear assembly off. I just have to repeat this process. I'm going to go over to the other side. I've got these same 3 bolts on the other side, and I'll go and repeat that process over there before we go any further. Okay, but there is one final step that we're going to need to do if we're dealing with a tower model. So in this case, you can see I've got tower mounts on this particular reformer. The tower mounts attach primarily to the rail, the side of the frame, but also there's a couple bolts that do attach it to the rear as well for stability. So obviously if my goal is to separate the side from the rear, and there's two bolts that are holding those together through this tower mount, I need to remove those two bolts as well. So again, only applies if you have tower mounts on your reformer. And if you do, it's just 2 bolts per side that you need to remove, the ones that are connecting it into the rear legs. Okay, and so you just use your larger Allen key and you're just gonna remove those bolts. I'm just loosening them both up here. Okay, and then again, if we can get them out by hand, that's a little bit faster. Okay, so there's one out, and I'll put it aside. And then for the other one, the other one's a little stiffer. I'll probably have to use the Allen key more for that one. Let's see about now. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so I'll put these 2 bolts aside, and I have 2 on the other side as well for the other tower mount. So I'll remove those as well. That's the last thing that's physically connecting this side to the rear of the frame. Okay, so now we're finally at the moment we've been working at, which is we're ready to actually remove the rear part of the frame. So what I've done is I've taken, you just want something that's going to prop up the rail when you take the rear off. Otherwise, obviously, it's just going to fall down to the ground. In my case, I just grabbed some weights that I've got. You can use a yoga block. You can use folded up towels. Just something, right? And so now all I have to do, because again, I've loosened these nuts, is I can lift up the rail. You'll see this lifts up and down now. And when I lift it up, those bolts can clear the hole and I can actually separate them. And now that's down. So there's the first side off, and I just go over to the other side and I do the same thing, right? I lift up on the frame, put it down. So now I've got, finally, the rear section of my frame is disconnected, and I can go and put that aside. And now we're ready to actually take the carriage, and the carriage can come right out now, right? It's a very simple process. Okay, so here's a better view of this process now that we're ready to take the carriage out. We've got our rails propped up. I'll disconnect the spring on the carriage that was holding it. We've got the carriage stopper removed, and so the carriage will quite happily roll right off the back. So I don't want to just dump it on the ground, obviously. So I just hold on to the carriage and I just support it as it comes out. And then I've got my carriage removed and I'll flip it. Now these springs are probably going to fall, but that's okay. Okay. And now we can see the wheels that I'm interested in replacing. It's these main carriage wheels here. There's one here, and then the 2 at the front. So these are the wheels we're going to go ahead and replace now. Okay, so let me show you how to replace this main carriage wheel. It's a little bit more complicated than the side ones. The side ones, you just take this nut off, put the new wheel on, you're done. The main carriage wheels have a little bit of an assembly. You can see there's a spacer in here with a secondary nut, and then a nut at the bottom, and a much longer bolt, obviously. So I'll walk you through this process on the first one, and then I'll just go and replace the other 3. So you're going to need 2 wrenches for this now. You can use the one that came in your toolkit again. It's completely suitable for this. And you'll just need your adjustable wrench once again. So I'm going to hold the nut at the top and the nut that's at the bottom. And then once I've get that adjusted first, there we go. Once I have both of those done, then I can loosen that. And basically I want to take that nut all the way off. Okay, and that's loose enough now. I can probably do it by hand. So there's also a washer that's going to come with it. I want to pay attention to the order that I take these off, right? So it's nut and washer, right? Those came off, so I'll put those aside. Now this whole assembly come out, you'll see there's a larger washer here. I'm going to leave that right where it was on the top, at the outside of the rail, right? I'm going to leave that there. So now I'm left with my big bolt with the wheel on it. I still can't change the wheel though because this spacer is here. So now my task is to remove this spacer, and it might be snug, so you might have to do the same trick where you would use both of the wrenches, right, to basically get on there and get that started loosen, and then you could screw that off the rest of the way, right? So I'm taking that nut all the way off. Again, I'm going to pay attention to the ordering here, right? It's nut and then spacer, right? There's a spacer here as well. Okay, And if you're ever wondering, you can always look at the other carriage wheels that you have on your reformer and just put it back exactly the way those ones look, and you'd be fine. Okay. All right, so that's off. The spacer is off. It went like that. Now, finally, I can take my old wheel off, put that aside, grab my new wheel. Now the new wheels, and let me see if I have one here. Yeah, here's one. If you look inside through the hole in the wheel, what you're going to see is that there's a spacer in there, a little metal piece that can be sort of out of center. And so sometimes when you go to put this through, well, that one worked, but sometimes that spacer might jam up the bolt. You can't get it through. Just jiggle the wheel. You'll be able to get it in. In the worst case, you just take an Allen key to push the spacer into the right spot as you put the bolt through. Okay? So now I've got my new wheel is on. Now I need to do everything in the reverse order from what I just did. So I take my spacer first. I put that back on. I take the nut that was behind the spacer and I put it on so that the wider part is facing away from the spacer, right? So the flange is facing down. So that gets screwed up. And we want that to be tight. Not overly tight, but just make sure you snug it. Hand tight's not quite good enough. You want it just a little bit tighter than hand tight. So you'll grab your 2 wrenches and you just give it that little bit of an extra snug. The wheel should still be spinning without any issue, right? You want to see that's happening. Then what I'll do is, I've still got my big washer here, right? So I put the bolt through the big washer, through the hole in the rails. And now I just need to put on the little washer that I took off originally and the little bolt back on to secure the whole thing. So we'll get that on and we'll tighten that by hand as much as we can. And then we'll give it the final tightening with the wrench. So you can see it's a little bit of a process to get the main wheels replaced, but it's not that bad once you get the hang of it. Okay, so that's hand snug now, and I'm going to do the same thing, right? I just want that to be just a tiny bit tighter, just tighter than hand snug, just a little bit. So I'll put that on. I'll use my adjustable wrench just to give that a little bit of an extra turn. So my wheel's still spinning, but it's very solid. There's no movement. Now I just have to take that entire process that I just did, and I'll do it for the other 3 main carriage wheels as well. Okay, so here we are. We've got all 4 of our main carriage wheels replaced, and now we're going to run through this entire process in reverse. So the first thing is we're going to slide the carriage back into place and then start reassembling the rear of the frame. Okay, so let's get started. I'll grab my carriage, I'll pick it up, and I maneuver it over. And let me just get a better grip on this here. And we just want to feed those carriage wheels nicely into the 2 tracks. There's 1 in, there's 2 in. Okay, and I'll feed that in. There we go. Okay, so the carriage is back in. Now let's get through that process of getting the rear frame put back on. Okay, so here we go. We've got our rear frame. We've got our side parts of the frame. We're going to put those back together. Same process. I just have to line up the 2 pieces, lift up the side rail so it'll fit in the slots where those bolts are, and then just let gravity take over and seat it down. And I'll do the same thing over here on the other side. Put it in and slots into place. So now these are now connected again. What that means is I can remove my braces that I had in there. I don't need those anymore. There we go. And make sure those are indeed fully seated. And now we can start tightening up our bolts. So here we are back. Once again, we've got our long 12mm wrench that we're going to use. And we're going to tighten up 1, 2, 3 bolts. And you do want these bolts to be fairly snug. You don't want to leave them loose. Don't kill it, don't strip the bolts, but you want it to be good and snug. Okay, and I'll do the same thing for the lower 2, which are always a little bit more difficult. There we go. Okay, that's 2 of the 3. Get that, I'll get that last one done. I was just going to see if I could hand tighten that. Not really, it's pretty far down there. So we'll do it the long way. There we go. Okay, so once again, nice and snug. That's that side done. I'm going to repeat that exact same process of tightening up those same 3 bolts on the other side. All right, so let's get our wood covering back in place. If you remember, there were 2 spacers that we saw at the beginning, and we want to put those back on the holes that's on the rail, right? There's 4 holes that we're going to be dealing with, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're not interested in the 2 holes at the back. You can see those are already higher. The goal of this spacer is to bring the height up to the level of the rear, right? So I'll put those 2 spacers in position with the flange at the top, right? That wide part is going at the top. Okay, then it's just a matter of sort of lining everything up, right? I've still got my 4 bolts protruding through. I've got the tube that the rear posts are going to wind up going through later on. I need all that stuff to line up and seat it in. Okay, so this is now seated in. And now what I have to do is just tighten up the 4 bolts. So it's the same thing we did at the beginning in reverse. So I take my Allen key, right? I secure the bolt. I look underneath and I can see where the bolt is protruding through. And I thread on my nut. Slowly but surely. There it is. And I get that up hand snug. And again, I don't need to kill this, but I do want it a little bit more than hand snug. And so what I'm going to do is take my wrench and use that to secure that. And then I can, well, it'd help if I spun it the right way. And then I can tighten up that bolt to get it snug. Okay, again, not going to over tighten it, but I am going to get it snug. Okay, so that's now secured on there. This tape is pretty good on this this grip tape here. It's pretty good at being stuck and unstuck. You can see this is on pretty good again. So just, you know, push it back down and it'll stay down. It'll be fine. Now I'll do the same thing. I've got my bigger bolt that's over here on the rear frame. So same thing. I take my larger Allen key. I secure it into that bolt. I'll grab my adjustable wrench. I look underneath to try to get that hooked onto the, oh, well, it'll help if I put the nut on. I'm going, gee, it's hard to hook that nut on there. There, put the nut on first. That'll help a lot. There we go. Okay. Now I can put my wrench on. That's a little bit better. And then I can tighten this up. Again, I'm going for snug. Very good. Okay, put that down. And I'm just going to repeat that process on the other side as well, get the other 2 bolts put on. Okay. Okay, next, our carriage stoppers. We want to put those back on. If we don't, then the carriage could slam into the back here and cause some damage. So remember, I put these back together. These were the ones that actually had 2 nuts on them. And so I'll take those off. We got the top nut, and then we've got the bottom one. And I'll take my bolt, my assembly, I'll put it through the rail. It's not lined up. There we go. So now that's protruding out the bottom. I'll take my little Allen key and I'll use that to secure the bolt in place, and I'll just hold that. So then I take first off my regular nut, that one, and I'll get that on and snugged up.
So I'll hand tighten it as much as I can. There we go. Then I'll take my wrench quickly and just give it that last snug. A little bit more. Oh, that's nice. And then I'll take the other bolt, which is that one that has the rounded cap, and we'll just screw that one on. It's not lined up. There we go. And again, just give that a little tighten with my wrench. And we're good. Okay, so that carriage stopper is secure. I've got my other carriage stopper for this other side, and I'll go ahead and secure that now. And finally, for those of you who have the tower mounts, you have the tower model of the reformer, you want to reattach the two bolts that you took out on each side that secure the tower mount L bracket to the rear frame. So those you should be able to just thread into their holes. Okay, this one as well. There we go. Okay, this one doesn't feel like it's quite seated. There we go. So you'll grab your larger Allen key for that. And we'll go ahead and tighten that up all the way. Okay, so there we go, and I'll go ahead and do that same process on the other side as well. Tighten up those last two tower mount bolts.